So Meisner in acting, and this whole topic of Meisner acting is an interesting topic because it's typically everybody thinks that if you're a Meisner actor, you've got to be really, really upset, you've got to be really, really intense, you've got to be very outspoken. But what ended up happening was when Sandy Meisner, when he was teaching, he taught in New York City, and then he came out to LA, and he taught in LA, and he taught more than one place. Actually, it was more than three. It was at least three places where he taught, and then he moved around a little bit more. But he was very, very adamant at the very beginning. The classes in New York City were very intense. And at the same time, when he started getting older, what ended up happening is that basically he started to get a lot softer within the classrooms, and he wanted to have things to be more sensible. So he wanted people to stop slamming the door, and he wanted people to stop being so violent with each other. Because in New York City, I mean, they had to have rules according to the various different violence in Meisner classes. And everybody knew it. Everybody couldn't believe. They were like, well, it's okay if you take a swing at somebody, but you can't harm them. And that was actually part of the Meisner actual approach. So when you hear some of the stories that actually went on for real, and you realize that with an effort for Sanford Meisner to bring actually realism into theater, there were real brawls that actually happened in classes, and there were actual physical contacts that happened in classes, and very few people want to admit that. I mean, some people do, some people don't, just depends on who's who. So when you're dealing with Meisner in acting, as to where it is today, today it's very different, slightly different than what it was back in New York City. And I've been lucky enough myself to study with people that have been back in New York, and I've been lucky enough to be very close and study with people that were in LA and various different situations. So it's a lot of changes that actually happened within the work. And some people, this is very similar to the Bruce Lee truth. And what happened with Bruce Lee was many different people would study with Bruce Lee, and they would study with him over a period of 20, 25 years. Some of them would only study with him for a year or a season or 2 years. And they would then swear that they were teaching the Bruce Lee technique. But the reality was they weren't teaching the Bruce Lee technique. That was the technique that Bruce Lee taught them, which is true. But it was a technique that Bruce Lee was working with and experimenting with as a martial artist at that time. And that happened to be the time where those people really learned from that, and that was a really great thing. So you can take that exact comparison and you can compare this to Sanford Meisner's career and Meisner in acting. Because many different teachers have learned plethora. I mean, people that were very close to him. But some people were very close to him for only a year or two. And some people were able to stay up and keep up with the changes of his work and his life's work. And many people had very different, they would be with him for 2 years, and then they would go off and they would start to develop their own thing. So this is where you get Meisner and acting having all this confusion. And so where Meisner is actually today is, it's all over the board. I mean, Meisner in acting, the basics of Meisner is acting. Now, acting itself, acting is in fact, it's the active emotions or the active feelings of the active is being activated in acting. That's what it is. It's a live ability that the actor has in acting, and that's essentially what acting is. Now, everybody wanted good work. There was a group that formed in New York City, and they decided that they wanted to have more realism in acting because they didn't believe some of the stage work that was happening on Broadway and off Broadway and other places. So they decided that they were going to really hunker down and say that they really wanted truth in acting. They wanted to make sure that they had the suitcases filled with like actual stuff that was packed. They wanted to make sure that the props were all actually looked very authentic. They wanted to make sure that there was realism brought back in the theater. Now, there were groups of people like this that date back into the what is it called? It's the United Artists group, where initially people had come up from the ranks that had had all kinds of filming having to do with the just beginnings of film. And then there was some groups in California that came out and they were like kind of wanting to have more realism on camera. And that was then parts of the whole thing. And then there was with the Westerns a little bit. And then there was other production people that would come out with that realism. So some of those people later, I mean, some of these are generations and generations of acting we're talking about over maybe 8 decades. So there was groups of people that wanted to have more realistic acting. And that was the changes that, I mean, you could go back even as far as vaudeville, where vaudeville had a certain stylistic of trying to perform and being very funny. And meanwhile, it was another group that was very interested in taking film to realism. So these are applicable to understand how the changes actually started to happen in the industry and why what is Meisner in acting still as it applies, because the reality of it is that there was decades of changes. There was certain changes that would happen where things would kind of go in the direction of realism, and then there was certain things. There was the whole film noir style where there was this sexy kind of like imaginary type film noir style, and it was this mystery, and then in various different regions like this. So people have had ideas about how to take acting in different directions, and this is good. And a lot of times when people think of Meisner, what they think is extreme expression. They think totally that it's totally extreme expression. There actually have been, and this is a true story, there have been people that have wanted to go and teach acting and teach the Meisner technique, and as soon as they tell the landlords for the theater or for this rental space that they want to do a Meisner technique class, they've had people hang up the phones on them or tell them no, their space is not available. Because there's been so many broken doors with Meisner everybody's thinking that if they have this extreme expression, that they're doing this Meisner thing and oh my God, they're more alive. This isn't the way that this is working, and this is not the way that Sanford Meisner's career developed from New York City all the way over into Los Angeles. So you can look at this and you can see that there's a progression as to the person's teaching, just like you can look at Bruce Lee, and you can look at Bruce Lee's Wing Chun and other formats of various different ideas for martial arts. And you can see how different people borrowed different things from different areas or learned themselves over their own study of natural body rhythm. And putting acting and Bruce Lee together is a bit of a dangerous thing, but the reality is that it's a very good comparison, because Bruce Lee had a very long career and he made lots of changes. And Sanford Meisner, had a very long career in teaching and he made lots of changes. And if people don't know that he made lots of changes, Well, that's the reason why there's such a conflict within the Meisner community. And this is why it's so interesting. Now, what I've done first, it's not a side note, this is actually on topic. What I've ended up doing here, as other people have done their own versions of things, and some are fantastic and some might not work, or they'll work with only certain groups or certain demographics. There is a book I've written, it's called Emotional Preparation. Now, we know that there's emotional preparation for film, we know that there's emotional preparation for theater, we know that there's emotional preparation that's for, you can use it for making creation videos, for making your own creator videos, or whatever you call it these days. So you can use it for all sorts of different techniques. And I've expanded the work that Sanford Meisner literally said. He said a quote. He said that he almost dared not teach emotional preparation. That was his quote. He thought it was that precious of a topic. So after, for me, it's been more than 20 years, although I had an injury from an actor who got violent with me. And that took me out for a little while, and it still has an effect. But the reality is that I've had over 20 years studying Meisner, and I won't say how much longer. So when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at every single thing I've learned from many different teachers that taught Meisner, and all the different class levels that I've been at, and I've been from the very beginning to the very advanced. Sometimes I find beginning work more interesting to watch because sometimes I see the failures really a lot at the advanced levels, but sometimes the advanced level work can be fantastic. And if you're forgiving enough while you're watching it, there can be levels and things learning, because I'm not just studying whether or not the acting work is good or not. I'm not just looking to see if it's a 2 thumbs up. When I'm watching the work of acting, I'm actually working to see whether or not, well, the biggest thing I've been looking for, the largest thing, was emotional preparation. I wanted to see whether or not the actors were getting their emotional preparation and how much of their emotional preparation was flowing into their work. Because on the topic of emotional preparation, there's a lot of opinions out there that emotional preparation is just for the first moment. And I absolutely respect the people that say that and have a very strong belief in that. But if you do emotional preparation correctly, with all the different layers, every single layer of the acting triangle, which I've come up with an acting triangle. Now I have an acting triangle that has first an idea. Then if you think about the idea during your emotional preparation actor's triangle, then you get a feeling, and then you get several feelings, and then some of those feelings, if you keep concentrating on those, instead of just going off that first impulse, then you'll end up having emotions. And then there's other aspects to it. So how that has to do with Meisner and acting is it has to do with developing the aspects of acting that is really the enchilance of the enchilance. This is very, very, very specialized work. You want to be able to serve up the emotional life so it's available to work with, but your partner actually works to pull it out. So instead of thinking of Meisner as this intense emotion where you have to force and push and push and push, which has been done in so many different classes and plays and many different plays on both coasts. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. When I say both coasts, I mean all coasts, including Europe. Whatever the situation is where you think that if you're you have to be in this intense emotion, and that the only thing that emotion is this intensity, that is not the way that Meisner actually wanted the work to be late in his life. And it might have been the way that he had it in some of the classes in New York. So some of the classes that he had in New York from firsthand experiences that I've talked to have said that they wanted to be able to have this intense emotion. They wanted to be able to almost like it was almost a forced reality. And that was where Meisner was just learning some of his own lessons as a teacher in New York City. So people would go through his lessons and they didn't recognize some of the work. There were a couple of students, more than a couple, but there were at least a couple, more than a couple, that came out to Los Angeles. And they came out to Los Angeles in the last decade of Sanford Meisner's teaching. And they came out and they were astonished. They couldn't believe it. They looked at him and they said, "This is the work now? You're not pushing the students the same way." He says, this is, we want the students to be able to have more of emotion. So he wanted them to be more subtle. He wanted them to be more, not to be pushed over, but he wanted people to, in their acting classes, to have more emotion. So the other major thing that Sanford Meisner wanted later in his career, and is later in his teaching career, is he wanted a spirituality in the work. So this was a massive contrast to the teachings that he had earlier in the work. So to understand that somebody went from being really intense in acting classes as a teacher, even coming up with rules of violence and rules of physical engagement between the students that they both agreed to when they were working. And fist fights broke out and all kinds of, it didn't matter if it was who was in the scene. There would be physical altercations. And those things happened. And then to have the same teacher come out to New York, come out to Los Angeles, and start to go deeper and deeper with his stuff on the island in Bimini, and start to go more into the acting elements of spirituality, was a lot for people to take in, because they had done, it was heartbreaking for some students, because they had done so much work to try and attain this thing. Like a lot of people looked at Sanford Meisner as like a father figure, a father they didn't have. I can relate to that because as well. So it's like a father they didn't have, and they wanted to be able to work hard enough to be able to please the teacher in the class. But the thing is that it was absolutely astonishing to them when the changes of the work, when it progressed, because they didn't know, like, they were still working on the steps that Sanford Meisner was teaching even 20 years later, where they were working on trying to get this intensity. But the reality is that they basically, they couldn't believe it. They thought, who the heck, what kind of, has Sandy lost his mind? He's teaching spirituality in an acting class, or he's teaching this acting class and saying that there's a connection to spirituality and acting. So with this aspect and understanding Meisner and acting, we take us to where we are today, which is we have a plethora of interpretations of what Meisner actually is. And I hope that I've been widespread enough in explaining it, because I'm not here to say that my interpretation of any kind of acting work is the only way. And I'm not there to say, even when I'm in the classroom, to be able to say, look, this is the only way to be able to study this work. I have sat and watched so many classes. I have sat and studied so hard at acting. I know that one student might not be the same as another student. So you've got one student there that might be a situation that might work a completely different emotional preparation way than another student. But there are some baselines that you can teach them to be able to work with it. And the acting triangle for emotional preparation is a key element that no one's taught, but it needs to be widespread because it gives a baseline of the steps to emotional preparation. So, if you like this video, I appreciate it if you do the whole like thing. I don't know what it does or doesn't do, but thanks. And understand that Meisner in acting means so many different things. It's not one specific element. We're talking about somebody who's had well over a 60-year career in acting. I think it was anyway, well over 60 years in acting of being known and having people seek him out as a teacher. So he had changes that he had justifications for based on the group. And then later on, it became more about trying to train certain people to do certain groups. He had certain exercises he would never do in New York. He would only do those in specifically for certain classes. So some people, like everybody knows that there's this thing called Spoon River exercises. Well, Spoon River exercises wouldn't be done in every single class. It would depend. It would depend. The fantasy work was one thing that was not done every single class. Every single 2 years was not done. So the Spoon Rivers were done more frequently. And then it also depended upon how many classes he was teaching, because when he was out in when he was out in Los Angeles, he was teaching. It depended if he was teaching with Marty, if he was teaching with Bob, if he was teaching with oh gosh, well, I'll remember the names later. But the thing is that the importance of this has to do with the ability to understand that the man's work goes over a wide spectrum. So, and now there's such a community internationally of people that teach these differences in exercises. There's a wide variety of how people teach the ins and outs, which are now called the doors and activities. There's a wide variety about how people teach repetition, which again changed over the years, right from New York City all the way to Los Angeles. And there's a wide variety of other things like that that happened. And with the missing pieces that are really being filled in by me and other people that, well, by me, and hopefully this will continue to expand, is that is emotional preparation. So the book is there to be in a situation where it's teaching multiple different types of people. The emotional preparation book is teaching multiple different types of people how to be able to use emotional preparation, even if they use a different technique. Because there's more than one technique in emotional preparation. All right?